Welcome back, everybody. I'm extremely pleased to start this next panel, which I think is an incredibly important one, about the war in Ukraine, about the information war in Ukraine. And I say that in that order for a reason. I think it's really important to remember during this conversation that the actual war is the story. The information war is an important input to that story. But there are real military operations going on, real people dying every day. And I don't want this to be some esoteric conversation about technology while losing the conceptualization and thread that there is an actual war on the ground going on, killing innocent people every single day. I'm joined by an esteemed panel with an extreme amount of knowledge about this topic. First, Natalia Levina. She's a professor at the NYU Stern School of Business. She is also Ukrainian and has family in Kharkiv and has an insider perspective on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine through her daily conversations with her family members, as well as family members and friends who are now refugees. She has been researching information systems for many years. She does a lot of work on crowdsourcing of information. She does a lot of work on information and communication in organizations. Natalia, it's fantastic to have you here for a variety of reasons. Also, Rick Stengel, who is a political analyst at CNBC. I love that he gives that as his title because he is an extremely esteemed person. Former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, former editor of Time Magazine, author of a fantastic book called Information Wars, which is highly relevant to the conversation today about his experience of the information war from inside the Obama administration in thinking about how Russia uses information. Rick, it's fantastic to have you. And Clint Watts, who's a distinguished research fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, but also former special agent FBI on the Joint Terrorism Task Force and author of Messing with the Enemy, where he details some really incredible stories of fighting terrorism online. He is one of the world's experts on information wars, and I couldn't think of three better people to be having this conversation with. We've got a lot to get to, so I want to get right into it. And Natalia, I want to start with you. You have family in Ukraine. You're also a professor that studies this type of information and communication. What are you hearing from Ukraine today on the ground, and as well your experience through those family members and friends that you have in Ukraine? What can you tell us about what's going on today?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sinan, for inviting me and for giving me this forum to speak about the events in Ukraine. First, as I've been studying and doing work in this field for many years and teaching, and for all these years, most of my students had no idea where Ukraine is, and for sure had no idea where Kharkiv was. And today, it's unfortunate that I don't have to start my classes by saying, hey, let's locate where I'm from on the map, because my city, Kharkiv, was destroyed, as many of you know, from the very first days with non-stop bombardment, because it's only really less than 20 miles from the Russian border. My day often starts with looking at what's going on in Kharkiv, and every day I hope that basically the bombardment of the city is less, but every day I wake up, including today, with the news that the bombardment and the shelling of the city intensified yet again. It feels that impossible, like, to have any more. And then, like many Ukrainians or even Russians who have family in Ukraine nowadays, starts by texting people we have there. And one of the things that I realized during this crisis was why during many conflicts, people who can evacuate don't all evacuate. So it's something that was a mystery to me as a Jewish person who saw how many people stayed in occupied territories, knowing what Nazis were doing with the Jews, as to why people would not leave. But now I actually, unfortunately, know an answer to this question, and that's because elderly people are often not in condition to leave. And I have 3 aunts, average age 80. So, and they're simply too frail. I have another aunt who's undergoing cancer treatment, which of course has stopped. They cannot leave. That means that their children my cousins have a very tough choice, right? Of whether to go somewhere and leave their parents behind, not to mention animals, which is another big issue. And people are very hesitant. So for my family, for first 2 weeks of the war, everybody stayed put in Kharkiv under bombardment. So my morning started with just checking if they're alive. So the first message is, how are you? And they answer, we are alive. And that happens usually through some sort of personal media. I then also kind of follow what happened. And so just to give you a perspective, the house I grew up in was, a missile fell there, I think after first week of the war, so my house is gone. The university I went to is partially bombed. The gym of the university where I played badminton has been shelled. Like, this is sort of every day you wake up with, what else can they do? Oh, right, the place where I was learning English after school, that one is now gone as well. So, but speaking more of a subject of information wars, so we do have this personal exchange with my relatives, just see what's really happening. I talk to my cousins who are all signed up for civil defense now, and some of them are bringing humanitarian aid, and talking to them about things that actually I don't think are covered in the media, especially US media as much, are the number of collaborators, unfortunately, that Russian government has on the ground. Kharkiv was 90%, Russian speaking, 90% just majority, and still is. But among this big population, a handful, small percentage are collaborating, and that creates a lot of damage. The other thing I was gonna, that I could tell you sort of from the ground is the focus over time that I've been following this. It's as many Ukrainians now count this as the 35th day of the war. It's not March 31st, sorry, New York sound. And what we see is, of course, now I'm communicating with people so some of the younger women with children have left for Poland. And one of the things, so I talk to them, I help them with housing, if I can, both monetarily and just through social network. And one of the things I was going to say about that is, and it's not reported as much, is that every single person I talk to who made it to Poland after many, many, many conversations that you have to take your children out of this, is that we're going to Ukraine tomorrow. They literally say, let me help you find housing. Oh no, we're going back to Ukraine tomorrow. They're so focused on we're gonna win and we'll come back there. They're really sort of amazing, the spirit of wanting to go back. And the last thing I was going to mention, more from the standpoint of, so my hat as a researcher, the grassroots campaign, the grassroots organizing around helping people and helping the army has been amazing. Like, again, the day could start with somebody on Facebook, a friend of a friend saying, we know that people in this hospital where my husband's classmate is a doctor really need these catheters. So everybody in the network is looking for medical catheters of a particular size that would then be shipped. And this brings me to this point that, to me, this crisis put the direct friendship relationships back into social media. So the social media about which you wrote so much, right, sort of thrives on really impersonal or sort of pseudo-personal connections, right? We build this relationship with people we have met once in our lives or not at all. In this crisis, we build this relationship with people we actually know but haven't talked to for 30 years. And this network's extremely strong. That's where trusted information and opportunities for help go through. And that's why I also see what's happening in other cities. And so that has been quite interesting to see this revival of interpersonal networks. And people reaching out to me as a professor and say, how could I help? And I would know if my aunt's neighbor who has a cow, and the cow, like I'm telling you a true story, the neighbor is in an isolated region where she cannot flee. and the hay for the cow was burned by the bombs that fell in their yard. So she needs money to buy hay for this cow. And she's saying, can you send them money? The most amazing thing is that this sounds to me like even 18th or 19th century story. But the fact that I can send her the money, Ukrainian currency, in 5 minutes, and in a bombshell, she can check on her phone that she received it, is what makes this time in our history surreal. Sorry for a long intro, but this is sort of what my life has been like outside teaching for the last 30 years.
It's activation of the traditional kinship and friendship networks through the digital channels. Do you know from your perspective and vantage point there, what they're using most? Is it Facebook? Is it WhatsApp? Is it text messaging?
So if we're talking about their media, what I know, the best of my knowledge, the tech savvy people getting most of their news from Telegram. So people subscribe to Telegram channels, and that's where they get most of the news, which we could talk about more professionally, right? Because the channels are not really monitored. It's really kind of hierarchical governance. It's whatever the person puts on the channel is what is seen as truth. So, and it cannot be, right? So just to give you another little perspective, like what you mentioned, is some of the pro-Russian Telegram channels operating in Kharkiv region and in Ukraine more broadly, in the early days of the war, started posting military information, right? Pictures of here is a Ukrainian soldier, and let's sort of helping Russian army advance. So actually, again, grassroots, a group of us tried to do something about it. And we learned very quickly how little we can do with direct encrypted communication, right? So it's very different from, so I reached out to people in WhatsApp to say what channels could be used. And basically the answer is nothing, right? Because WhatsApp has to comply with regulation of the US government. It's very hard to make those regulations work for Telegram. So you have to have grassroots efforts to undermine the channel, which is the fascinating story of the difference between social media.
Yeah, and I think that that is the double-edged sword of Telegram, which we're going to definitely get to in just a minute. Natalia, thank you. I definitely am going to come back to you very, very shortly to get your perspective again shortly. I want to turn to Rick for a second. Rick, you wrote this fantastic book on information wars. You've been thinking about information wars and Russian information operations in the broader geopolitical landscape for quite a while. You certainly have followed everything that happened during the Crimean annexation in 2014 very closely, intimately, and have seen everything evolve since then. So I wanted to get your perspective on Russia then and now. What does Russian information operations and information war tactics look like now compared to then? Has it evolved? Is it more precise, more advanced? Is it the same? Are they falling behind? Are they lagging now? What is your sense of the evolution of the Russian side of this information war?
Thank you, Sinan, and it's great to be with you, and thank your wonderful alma mater, MIT. It's an important topic, as you said, and it's important that you said at the top that the information war is not the war. The brutal aggression of Russia against basically defenseless enemy is the war, where thousands of people are getting killed every day. The information war, so much in our society now where social media has seemed to actually replace reality or social relations. I'm glad that Natalia mentioned the kind of reinvigoration of friendship networks within social networks. It's a very good question because you mentioned my book, because a lot of my book is about Russian disinformation efforts in 2014 and 2015 around what we then called the annexation of Crimea, which we are now calling the first invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, that was an example of the sort of hesitancy of the US government around the Russian actions, that we didn't really call it what it was. And we didn't really know what it was, which brings me to your question, because one of the advantages that Russia had in 2014 in Crimea was that it was a stealth operation. I mean, compared to now, I mean, the invasion of Ukraine, where they massed 180,000 troops over weeks on the Ukrainian border that the world could see. But what happened in Crimea in 2014, if folks remember, was the sneaking in of Crimea of the so-called little green men, which Putin for weeks denied were Russian military, were actually Spetsnaz, the Russian special forces. But you know, and I can't speak for everything that the US government knew, but there was a lot that we didn't know. It was a surprise. What we did know was that the messaging that they had done around the revolution of dignity in Ukraine in 2014, of accusing the Ukrainians of being Nazis or neo-Nazis, of being anti-Semitic, all of these memes and kind of symbols that resonate with the Russian audience. And remember, just in general, I'm going to pull back for 1 second. There are multiple audiences here. And for Putin, ultimately, his domestic audience is probably his most important audience, the most important circle within the concentric circles. As Americans, we, because we're narcissists, we tend to think everybody's messaging to us, and that's all that they're thinking about. But that's not all that Vladimir Putin is thinking about. So what grew out of that annexation of 2014 was the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg, which already existed, which was creating messaging around the upheaval in Ukraine. And then they transferred it to the 2016 election. What they used then were cutouts, bots, fake personas. And one of the things that I write about in the book is that it's not that they were so good, it's that we were so susceptible. Disinformation is always seeks a kind of a buyer's audience, and people are receptive to it. So if you look back at the kind of content they were creating around 2014, even focused on Ukraine, it was simple. It wasn't smart, wasn't witty. When the stuff they did in English in 2014 was ungrammatical. Poor use of American idioms. But as someone once explained to me, it's like the emails that you get from the prince in New Zealand or Africa, wherever it is, asking for money for $1 million, and you'll get 10 million back, and it's filled with grammatical mistakes and spelling errors. Marketing guy said, that's deliberate. I said, why is that? He said, because then they know they have you hooked if you respond. If you're not put off by the grammatical mistakes and the bad idioms, you're a sucker. And that is what happened in 2016 and the stuff that the Russians did here. Again, it's not that it was so successful or so sophisticated, it's that we were so susceptible. Cut to this invasion, and the Russian messaging has seemed antiquated, very yesterday, very clunky. And by the way, they are clunky, but they had the advantage of surprise in 2014, which they don't have now. So we just we've seen how clunky they are, how uncreative they are, which again, they were back then. And in fact, it surprises me, and Clint knows way more about Russian messaging than I do, but part of the Russian ethos is of hybrid warfare, as we call it, the Gerasimov doctrine, who after the general who's close to Putin, this idea that in modern warfare, 4/5 of it is not kinetic, is information war, is propaganda, etc. They have a kind of a sophisticated 30,000-foot view, but not in terms of executing it. I mean, if that was really your doctrine, what Putin should have said is, I want to see the top 10 memes that you're going to release, on the day of the invasion, and show me the propaganda that we're sending to Ukrainians, and that they would have this whole information war blocked out like they have their old-fashioned kinetic war. Well, they didn't have that, and because Putin's expectations and maybe their military's expectations were wrong, that they would be greeted with bouquets of flowers, and maybe that would be their information, their memes. In fact, the Ukrainians have fought valiantly. They haven't submitted. If anything, Putin has caused all the things that he didn't want to have happen, which is the consolidation of NATO and the rise of nationalism in Ukraine and appreciation for democracy, but their cupboard was bare. They had nothing. And just to my kind of artificial eye, and then they had been overwhelmed by the creativity and nimbleness of the Ukrainians on TikTok, obviously on Facebook and traditional platforms, but people have been calling TikTok war talk. There's so much Ukrainian stuff on it, and a lot of it is great. And again, it's witty, quick, etc. So the short answer to your question, Sinan, is that the Russian 2014 versus Russian 2022 is like day and night. They've really seemed outmastered. They've seen behind the times, years out of date, and they're paying the price for it. And to go back where I started, I also wrote about the counter ISIS messaging we did in government, which was going on at the same time as the annexation of Crimea. And a general, American general, said to me, the worst message is when ISIS takes a city from us, and the best message is when we take a city from ISIS. There is a reality on the ground. And part of the reason the Russians have been outmastered, outnumbered, is because the reality on the ground isn't very good for them.
Excellent. I really appreciate that insight. And Clint, I want to bring you in and see if I can't ask you to contrast that view of Russia from the perspective of Ukraine's information operation during this invasion and during this war. And particularly if you wouldn't talk to us a little bit about how you see and evaluate President Zelensky's use of traditional and social and other types of encrypted media, to what effect, what's the strategy, is it working, and so on. And then also I wanted to ask you about Mikhailo Fedorov, who's the Deputy Prime Minister, Ukraine's Minister of Digital Transformation, who has out and out declared World Cyber War I and been extremely focused on the digital elements of this war. There have been numerous interesting stories of him having great effect on, for example, convincing a Chinese drone company, DJI Global, from geofencing their drones from working inside Ukraine by the messaging that he's been putting out. So I just wanted to get your broad take on the Ukrainian side of this information war.
Yeah, so thanks, Sinan, and thanks for having me here. And I think that's the big surprise, is that in the converse to what Rick was talking about, which is this, it's not top-down, vertical, linear, but it's robust and organized to a degree, the Russian approach. The Ukrainian approach, when it kicked off, was the opposite. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't had support from the West in terms of training over the years, right? We've run these programs. The State Department has run programs. The Department of Defense runs programs talking about how do you do public affairs. And I don't think any of that mattered, because you have a president who was an actor and he's really good on camera. So I think that this really reflects, the parts of the system that matter. And oftentimes too much, we tend to think a bot is going to overachieve what a real human will, and we take that human being out of it. But President Zelensky, this is a time when it's great to have an actor who is your messenger, right? He's brilliant on camera. From what I understand, a lot of his production is done by people that used to do production with him. Everything probably from script writing to filming, visual production. Those things are really important. And I think this is also a change from even Crimea and election 2016, when we started talking a lot about the information space and social media, is that video is king now across all platforms. So you've got platform changes over the last decade that make video-enabled social media much more available and ubiquitous. TikTok is a prime example of that, but Instagram, YouTube, all of this is video-enabled, and everybody has a camera. So if I had gone and done, even when I was doing ISIS research a decade ago, as they were starting to rise over Al-Qaeda, they were putting out kind of high gloss sort of videos, cutting things with Adobe, man, it looks very bootleg compared to what you're seeing coming out of Zelensky and his administration. It's super dynamic. He's really good on camera. He's, you know, a natural at it. He does a great job of communicating. Separately, I think in terms of the distribution, it's been the power of the platform whenever you're crowdsourcing your virtual army. And that's really, I think, when you're talking about the deputy minister of Ukraine, what he's been able to do is he has no resources necessarily at his disposal, but he's got a worldwide audience that wants to help. And it's remarkable to watch because, please, for the audience, don't confuse too. When we watched Terrorist a decade ago, they would use this approach, reach out to the diaspora community, you know, try and bring in supporters, try and bring in back then remittance payments, those sorts of things. Fast forward a decade, now you're seeing nation states, a nation state, Ukraine, successfully use a similar type approach of crowdsourcing cyber armies, crowdsourcing materials, using cryptocurrencies, using gateways through Telegram to communicate and associate. And so a decade ago, we were talking about Twitter as the distribution platform. The information battle today is on Telegram. And that's where you see it in the Russian language, Ukrainian language. I'd had somebody ask me, well, what should I watch on Twitter? And I was like, don't, like, unless you want to know what Americans are saying about it, you know, or some Western, but everything has been on Telegram for, you know, a good while. And I think that's because it's one of those ungoverned places. And it's a place where at different times we've complained a lot about Telegram not being moderated or regulated. Right now, you're seeing the Ukrainians use it to a successful degree to do distribution of content and connecting with like-minded audiences all around the world. I think the other part that's fascinating is there's a foreign fighter that I check on every morning. I can pull it up. He is on Twitter and he's soliciting donations. He's getting donations. He's coordinating shipments. He's communicating in the English language back out to Americans and people in Europe. That's remarkable because we thought of it from the threat perspective a decade ago. That's what we saw adversaries, the non-state actors doing. Now we're seeing a nation state essentially, you know, bring in a lot of manpower. And then the one that's most remarkable, I think, is the idea of a cyber army. Essentially, the deputy minister, Fedorov, he's just picking targets, and then an army appears out of nowhere and starts working, you know, essentially at the behests of the Ukrainian government. They don't know who it is, but it also creates this weird sort of wrinkle over time, I think, when we start talking about regulation and what we'll do. Okay, if an American does, I'm just hypothetical, an American does a cyber attack on a foreign target that supports Zelensky's administration, a target that they picked, a Russian website, whatever it might be, is that a crime? You know, we're going to get into this weird sort of things. And foreign fighters, we used to worry about humans, you know, going into Syria to join ISIS. That was considered a terrible thing. We were always trying to control it. Now you'll see a flood of Westerners just going buying tickets and walking into Ukraine and joining up with a legitimate army, like saying it overtly, like, I am joining up with this army. So all of our like norms around how state conflict runs, I think will change, because this is the first social media powered state conflict, you know, state actor that I've seen use it in the same way that we traditionally have seen with non-state actors. I think the last part that I'm finding fascinating is Anonymous, whoever they are, is doing widespread attacks, lots of doxing. You're seeing Ukrainian soldiers get the phone numbers essentially of their adversary and doing psychological operations, direct text messaging kind of things to soldiers that are out on the front lines. This is remarkable. And then the last part, which comes down to information control, I think is the test like of time here in the coming months, is Russia has essentially been shoved off the Western internet to a large degree. Now they're tied up, you know, internally. You can go on VK right now, and they're like advertisements and tools to take your Instagram and move it to VK, which I think is interesting because Instagram is wildly popular inside Russia. So when that switch happens, can Russia really control? They are not China. They've never been able to control the same way that China does. Will it drift in? Will the content drift in over time? Or it's really about audience segmentation, I think. And this is probably, you know, a better question for Natalia, but who is on these platforms or was on these platforms in Russia? That's one audience that matters. Is that the military folks? Maybe not, right? Because the lower class tends to be recruited in. So you're communicating maybe with the higher class higher class socioeconomically may not care or may not react the way that we think they would. So just I can see a million dissertations from the physical and virtual world coming out over the next year or two, just based on this dynamic landscape we have right now. I've never seen it in a state context.
Clint, I wanted to ask you, so you mentioned Telegram and the use of it and the importance of it. Early on, we had a moment where Pavel Durov, the founder and CEO, along with his brother of Telegram, said, okay, we're going to consider whether or not we're going to, in some ways, moderate the speech that's happening on our platforms. Now, note to all of those who don't know who Pavel Durov is or his brother and the history of Telegram, he is in an information and probably in most other ways an extreme libertarian. He believes that there needs to be freedom from all government in his conceptualization, oppression and freedom to say and do whatever you want. He has always held that Telegram will never moderate any kind of content, and that's the whole point of Telegram. So to hear him say, even at the beginning, hey, we are thinking maybe we might want to moderate something, and then he said, okay, we thought about it, we're not going to moderate Telegram. And I think that moment was a really interesting moment, because you could see him being tested on his libertarian views that he's espoused for years. And now you see that has made a big impact on the role of Telegram in this war. And so my question to you is, Telegram and Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and so on, what do you think of the platform's policies as you've seen them evolve during the war, in terms of, how they're handling misinformation, how they're handling Russian state news, how they're handling advertisements? Is there a difference between a Chinese-owned TikTok and a Western-owned and American-owned, Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp and so on?
So at least from my perspective, it's shocking. This is the first time I've seen the industry kind of all move together and do mostly the same thing. Usually there was one platform that sought to distinguish itself by doing something different or opposite of the other, and they all generally have moved. They have different kinds of problems. So right out of the gate, TikTok had gone after official state accounts, but then there was coordinated authentic behavior, which is really the new danger in many ways. There were Russian content creators that were essentially being coordinated to push content up online that was disinformation. And they actually eliminated the ability of even content creation to a degree inside Russia for at least a time period there. And so it's pretty remarkable that all of them have kind of shifted and moved, with the exception of Telegram. And then the opposite has happened in Telegram, which is you've seen, instead of Russia just dominating it all out, which they kind of were to a degree at one point. Now you've just seen this Ukrainian wave come back in and sort of surge against it, which I think will be instructive in the future of what a future information counteroffensive would look like. In the sense that if you're going to have some sort of relay or portal, Telegram is essentially the relay between the Russian internet right now and the US Western, NATO internet. If you're going to have that kind of a relay, how do you handle it if you're not going to shut them off entirely? And essentially it is speed, volume, trusted source, no rebuttal, keeping all those principles still in play the same way you would if you're doing an information campaign. And I liked what Rick said before, that Vladimir Putin doesn't check the 10 memes, before they launch. The US does. I mean, they go through an exhaustive review of content, when ultimately it is a content war. You have to give the audience enough content to drive and thrive and share and seek to advance. And so far, Ukraine is doing it just by having a great messenger, a good system, engaging the public, and using popular support essentially to drive their message. So I think there's tons to learn from what's happening right now that would be instructive for democracies as well as it goes forward.
Natalia, I want to ask you, you and I have had a conversation offline about the dramatic importance in this moment of China's policy. China obviously has an extremely controlled information ecosystem. Mm-hmm. official Chinese national policy towards the war in Ukraine is extremely important, obviously, because they are the one sort of powerful global ally that Putin would look to rely on to have support for his positions in this war. And the Chinese population's opinion about the war is likely important for the dynamic evolution of the Chinese policy. And yet the information is so dramatically controlled. So I wonder if you could comment about the role of China, how important China is or isn't, as well as the role of information and the information war as it's related to content and communications that gets to the Chinese people or doesn't in terms of shaping that policy.
Yes, so I have to start by saying that I haven't in the past focused on studying Chinese news. It's an area that many other esteemed colleagues have studied. But as the conflict started, it became increasingly clear to me from reading the analysis, from listening to my colleagues from political science communities that the Chinese position would be extremely important in this war. And it's, I think, very clear by now to many people that China is benefiting economically, right, as a country from this conflict. So in some sense, it makes sense for them to prolong it, right? So just on economic side of it. And it's also clear, so I do teach a course in international business, among other things, and it's clear that in terms of global commerce, there is we are very reliant on China, so it's not very much we could do in terms of sanctions. I'm not going to say like we can do something, but it's a very hard target, right? So and it's also quite quickly I learned from again my political science colleague Josh Tucker that they have analyzed Chinese news, and they assume to be what he said is using RT stamps. So they take Russian television story basically and push it into Chinese media, and they censor. So we've read in public accounts that even so Ukraine has a lot of educational institutions, so it's quite a lot of Chinese studying in Ukraine as well as doing business in Ukraine. When these people post, like I'm here in a bomb shelter in WeChat, it gets censored. So the censorship seems to be very active in terms of what gets censored. Driven by the desire to do something, as many of us not in Ukraine feel quite helpless. So we try as we can, with money. But so I try to see if something could be done, and because I don't know this area, I'm not sure. But what occurred to me is, and I do think that this audience, the people you gathered today for the summit, have a role to play. Because we could talk to people here, right? The people in the United States. In my class, I have a lot of people from China in all the audiences I teach, to bring the truth. So one of the things that Zelensky often talks about is, I don't want you to be pro-Ukrainian, I want you to be pro-truth. And some of these things are just true. There are Russian missiles falling on my cities. It's just the fact. And the tanks are right there. And this all is accurate information that I have no doubt about. Now, who is responsible for the conflict could be argued depending on your political positions. But if we could just show to people in China what's going on and inform them, I think it would be useful. And we do have some of these channels open through people here. And I think that this brings me back, and I see an audience question about these friendship networks and the potentially positive role of social media, which I know, Sinan, given your book, is very minimal. But if there is any such role, it would be in sort of relying on this professional and other friendship networks to inform people who otherwise may not take side in the conflict about what's going on, and hopefully then inform others. So I actually talked to fellow IS academics with whom I'm working on a research paper who happen to be from India, which is another market, as to what their friendship groups in India are talking about. And it's like, well, we have a cousin group, and in this cousin group on WhatsApp, usually, which is a typical, like we do talk about this conflict and opinions are divided. So what I'm hoping is like, maybe we can use some of the influence we have in this forum and others and have more forums to inform people here who can then hopefully deliver some information there. I also have one other remark, and that's about the language. And I heard, you yourself writing how Ukraine is winning the information war, and the fellow panelists are saying how this is happening. I am very doubtful that this is happening at scale in Russia or in markets like China. And just to give you an example, so of course, one media that is we could access that's widely available in China is TikTok. So just this morning, I did a search in 3 languages on the term Ukraine, in English, Russian, Ukrainian, and I did a Google Translate for the word Ukraine in Mandarin. And what I saw is very, very sad, right? So if I went and typing in the word Ukraine and Mandarin in my TikTok search, every single video was pro-Russian. Some of them were violently pro-Russian. Some of them looked like fake to me. Some of them were this beautiful Russian women saying how, like, that they are being abused, and it looks very well done professionally, looks like to me, in Mandarin. The women are speaking in Mandarin. So I don't think we're paying enough attention. And I think it's unfortunately premature to say that Ukraine has won information war as widely. It's winning it, and I'm glad we do have Zelensky in the European kind of English-speaking communities in the US. But in Russia, many people still just get their news not even from Telegram, but from the TV, as many of you know. And here again, it's not my area, but I do read. And as you probably know, right, so the Russian news was slightly less censored in the last, from 2014 until now, as compared to what they are today. And that's important to acknowledge, that it's not so clear to me that, the things, we are better at fighting information war in Russia because we have this 8 years of experience, because Russia shut down all the independent news channels. So the only people getting independent media in Russia in Russian are liberal people who know how to install VPN. And from what I've heard, 5% of Russians have installed VPN. So take it as it is.
Yeah, no, I think this is a really important point, especially the information environment in China and Russia. And in fact, in that article that you referenced that I wrote for the Washington Post about how Ukraine is winning the information war, I specifically single out TikTok and say TikTok, as a Chinese-owned company, is the one that isn't moving in lockstep with the others. And when you do those searches, which I also did, and you see the channel that's been established called War Talk, it is unlike what you see on a lot of the other channels. So I made sure to include that in the article precisely for the reason that you stated. I want to actually kind of take a question from the audience and direct it at Rick, but I want to kind of massage it a little bit, which is this is a comment that I get a lot, a question that I get a lot when talking about these topics, which is basically, doesn't the US use similar weaponized social media around the world? Isn't that part of our information operations? Is there hypocrisy when the US or the West, talks about Russian misinformation, but perhaps engages in it itself?
So yes, I get that question myself a lot, Sinan, and maybe I was out of the loop when I was in government because nobody included me in those meetings where we're creating, U.S. government memes pretending to be regular people. But I'm being ironic because I found in government, to my great relief, and I hope people, believe me, that there was very little of this that went on. Almost none of it at the State Department, none of it at the White House, maybe a little bit at the Defense Department, but not to a great degree, and not in the intelligence community either. I mean, the folks who are in government, and I'm talking about the kind of the civil servants and foreign service officers, I mean, are so reluctant and hesitant to do the very things that we're decrying, to use the techniques of our adversaries. And I know that sounds earnest and sincere and all of that stuff. But that was my experience, and I'm pretty sure that hasn't changed. One of the reasons for that, and when I was in government, when we talked about this, I would always bring up the idea that, like, you know what, the private sector in the US does this to a degree that we in government couldn't even begin to approximate. Like, why get in the way of what's happening already in the private sector? We just can't compete with that. I mean, it's like, if you're good at creating content or messages or memes, you're not going into government. Maybe you'll used to go to Hollywood, and maybe used to go to New York in journalism, but now, you're making millions of dollars from ads on TikTok. So, so the short answer to that question is that we don't really do that. And I remember once in Clint mentioned, doing counter ISIS stuff. I remember once sitting in the Situation Room at the White House, and we were talking about, what we could do, counter disinformation, to people that ISIS was trying to reach or did reach. And a gentleman whose name would be familiar to you that I'm not going to mention looked around the room and said, maybe we're not the best messengers for this message. And it was a bunch of, white people. And it was a smart point, because of course people distrust any message from the US government by its very nature. And we just don't do very much of that. And I think in part because we don't have to, in part because we're not good at it, and in part because it's counterproductive. A government counter messaging is counterproductive. That was my, one sentence experience when I was in government.
Thanks for that. Clint, I want to ask you about what I've seen more front and center during this particular invasion and war than in any other geopolitical circumstance that I've seen, even in recent times, which is the rise of the importance of essentially citizen surveillance, if you will. And there I'm talking about the widespread use and availability of cell phones, taking video footage of, and Natalia was mentioning this earlier, tanks are here, troops are there, bombings happened just now here, in addition to analysis of publicly available satellite imagery, because we have private companies that make those satellite images publicly available, as well as even the use of Google Maps. I heard a story of a research team noticing a traffic jam along the highways going towards and into Ukraine in the sort of hours before the invasion, signaling a mobilization of those forces across the border prior to them actually coming across the border. So I wonder if you could comment on the importance of the rise of the digital civilian citizen surveillance ecosystem in this war, and therefore going forward.
Yeah, I think this is the discussion in 2010 was open source will become the high side. That was the theory over time, meaning that classified is known as high side inside the government. Classified information would become smaller in volume and more specific over time, and that a general understanding could be achieved through everything in the open source. I think that's what you're seeing. But with that, the volume of content and ability to create content makes it easier to make more propaganda and disinformation as well, which can skew perceptions around what's going on and create lots of confusion. And so if you have voices out in the social media space, more voices putting out disinformation than the truth, regardless of whether it's war tracking or any issue, you're going to get into trouble over time because it will warp people's perceptions. Just a volume, of content, and then an availability bias to whatever content you encounter. So I think for those that are trained and know what to look for, it's fantastic. You can see and make out so much, and you can go to different scholars, in the war in Ukraine that are doing military work, and you can really see fascinating work. Rob Lee, Michael Kaufman, some of these folks are basically giving you a battle day-by-day breakdown that's impressive. Now, they also, in the news networks, I go on MSNBC, a lot, and we're talking about battle tracking, where the battle goes. It's difficult still, though, to fact check because you don't know who the source is of that information to such a degree that you can actually verify, like, yes, that phone was right there. That's what they were doing. That's what they were filming. So you can have a general understanding, but sometimes fact checking gets even tougher, right? Because a news network can't have content, someone out filming every content. And now you're trying to verify something and you're 99% sure that that's real, but you can't make a mistake, right? So it creates this perception loop. Another part that I find interesting is that that open source, I still don't feel as if governments and government intelligence services have really mastered that open source yet, to where they almost are still behind a lot of folks that are out just working from their house. And, there was a gentleman from Australia that did a battle map today. It was the best one I've seen. I have no idea who that is. He's in Canberra. And I saw it. I immediately followed him and I'm like, whoever that is, they are fantastic. He looked to be like 25 years old. I don't know, but he's done all and assembled all of this. So it does provide a special power, though, to those that can figure that out and understand it, even from a government perspective. So, they never put me in charge in the government. There's good reason for that, probably. But if I were in charge in the government, I would just say, hey, stop 50% of what you're doing. Now let's take these very crazy intelligence tools you got and let's focus them off of this base layer of what everyone essentially knows. I think the last part is the element of surprise that they achieved in Crimea is gone. I mean, that is vanished now that we've sort of gotten a better baseline understanding of this. So the Russians used disinformation. They kind of fooled us. They fooled the world, the little green men, all those sorts of things. It was really brilliant how they did it. This time it did not work at all. The US intelligence community was way out in front of it. The NATO partners were great. You're hearing it today. I think it was GCHQ in UK. They came out and said, this is what's going on. So they're adding that extra layer, like we're doing intercepts. We know the troops are hungry and cold and, the Russians are having trouble with logistics. So you can almost see how governments can work with their democratic populaces over time without instructing them or even telling them what to do, to understand the situation. And then they can even be more efficient with their really cool tools to do things like satellite image beyond what is, already openly available that you and I can see at home, or UAV drones. I've seen remarkable, what look like Amazon purchased drones in Ukraine, giving you, block by block layouts of what's going on in terms of a battlefront. That's just remarkable. And that just leaves, a few things out there that even the governments could use to tip the open source community too. Much the way the Zelensky, Fedorov, they're using the public in this way. We could be doing that too. We say, hey, the Russians, they may have a naval armada. This is a great example for OSINT trackers out in the Black Sea. And you would essentially push an army of thousands of OSINT hunters in the right direction. And so this is going to be a new paradigm shift, I think, over time for democracies. They don't have to be so scared about the internet. They can learn to leverage it as well for good.
I mean, one thing that I thought was a 180 and instructive in so many ways was the use of transparency as a strategic element in this war. So the thing that struck me at the very beginning was the flagging of the false flags out in public early and often. It used to be that war was this clandestine activity, and the Defense Department would get in front of the press and they would say, well, obviously, we can't disclose any details and there won't be any talk of anything that's actually happening. But let me just give you the broad view. No, here it was sort of like, there are 180,000 troops on the border. What we are hearing from our intelligence, our secret intelligence that only we should be knowing, I'm going to tell the entire world, we're expecting false flag operations to justify the war. They may look like this. They may be videos, this and that. And I thought that was such a new thing in terms of using transparency as a weapon in order to sort of foil what we saw in Crimea happening, and this time to much less of an effect. I want to turn to Natalia. And Natalia, I know that you have been speaking a lot in public. You've been doing different kinds of lectures. You've been having many different kinds of conversations. I wanted to sort of give you the last word and to ask you, what is it that you want people to know? You know, whether it's the technically minded community, the sort of digitally savvy community, the students who are either of Chinese origin or Russian origin or Ukrainian origin, you know, the governments that are involved. Like, what is the main message or the main messages that you think are really important for us to know, and maybe we aren't hearing enough today?
Thank you, Sinan, for giving me this opportunity, first of all. And I think what I'm going to say is not a big surprise to anybody, but it is what I think, again, President Zelensky has been saying. And it is that people, and that you've been saying in your book, right, we have to be active skeptics, not cynics. Like, I don't know if, like, we really need to keep checking the information and to not be lazy enough to say, in this world of information overload, we will just pick, you know, a trusted source or our echo chamber. And I think that's the first message, would be like, just go this extra step of connecting to multiple media, preferably in multiple languages. So my own day starts with news in all 3 languages. And also I check UK and US news just to see the balance between European and US. So I know not everybody has the luxuries that academics have, but to have several significantly different sources of information and to question things is what I hope we do, and what I actually hope we teach our kids, right? So that is, to me, and it would serve us well in other conflicts as well, right? That's on the basic. And the second thing I want the world to know is that at the end of the day, to me, Zelensky and many people there are more than actors. And I think that I would like to I've followed actually him as a person for years. And you could argue that he's acting in some of these videos, but if you've seen him in interviews, and there was an amazing interview of the Russian independent journalist, which was not published in Russia, but which I encourage all of people able to access it language-wise to hear here, you see the authentic person that he is. So I've seen leadership professors talk about how they should learn leadership from Zelensky. I think the number one thing is sort of goodness and authenticity. That is hard to fake. And I know I may sound like naive and overly patriotic here, but I actually think that we have to choose whom we can actually trust and not be cynical. So this balance between skepticism and cynicism would serve everybody well. And there is a real war and people are dying, and we shouldn't doubt that. And we should try to understand more about it before just deciding to trust a single source.
I really appreciate that. I wanted to add just one thought, which is something that really, really scares me today, which is essentially that we have such rapid news cycles. And what I am most concerned about is that as this war goes into, you know, the many more weeks, many more months, and so on, that people begin to lose interest. And what I really hope happens is that we keep this every single day front and center of the conversation every single day. I don't go one day without talking about this, whether it's in public or in private, that it's happening, what's the news today. I don't want this to be sort of for it to start to fall on deaf ears and people start to tune out, because this is the most important thing happening on our planet at this moment in an acute sense. And we have to treat it as such until there is a satisfying resolution. To the 3 of you, thank you so much, Rick, Clint, Natalia. This has been a fantastic and extremely important conversation. And we've got another one coming up right now on responsible AI. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.